There is a very specific sound a marriage makes when it finally breaks. For Eleanor, it wasn't a screaming match. It was the sharp, ugly tear of a $2,000 credit card receipt for a luxury lingerie boutique bought for a 29-year-old assistant. Her husband Vance thought he held all the cards. He thought he was discarding a quiet, invisible, financially dependent housewife to fund his midlife crisis. He even handed her the divorce papers with a smirk, offering her a rusty minivan while he kept the house and their life savings. But Vance made one fatal billion-dollar mistake. He had no idea that the woman he spent 20 years belittling was secretly the founder of a tech empire holding a $1.2 billion acquisition contract in her hands. He wanted to play a ruthless game of power. So she decided to let him win the battle right before she annihilated his entire wars. The lesson here is simple but lethal. The most dangerous woman in the room is never the loudest one. It is the woman who lets you believe you are in control right up until the trap snaps shut. If you have ever been made to feel small just to make someone else look tall, this story is for you. Hit that like button to claim your own power, share this video with someone who needs a reminder of their worth, and subscribe to the channel for more stories of elegant, ultimate revenge. Now, let's dive into Eleanor's masterpiece.
The paper tore. A sharp, ugly sound. Eleanor flinched. The noise echoed against the high ceiling of the kitchen. The bitter smell of burnt coffee hung heavily in the air. A cold draft leaked through the window above the sink. It chilled the back of her neck. She stared down at her hands. Her fingers were trembling slightly. She held a ripped piece of thick, white paper. It was the monthly statement for their joint credit card. Vance stood across the marble kitchen island. His face was flushed red. He breathed heavily. He gripped the other half of the torn statement in his fist. "I told you to stop opening my mail," Vance said. His voice was too loud. It was defensive and sharp. "It came to the house," Eleanor replied. She kept her tone perfectly even. "It was sitting on the counter. It was not sealed." "It is my corporate expense account," Vance said. He crushed the paper into a ball. He threw it into the stainless steel trash can. "It was our joint account," Eleanor said. "You know I use that for business," Vance said. He smoothed the front of his expensive gray suit. "I need liquidity for client dinners." "Since when do client dinners happen at a luxury lingerie boutique?" Eleanor asked. The words hung in the air. The kitchen was completely silent. The refrigerator hummed a low, steady note. Eleanor watched her husband of 20 years. He was 50 years old. He still had a full head of dark hair. He was handsome. But right now, he looked entirely like a stranger. Vance refused to meet her eyes. He looked at the coffee maker instead. "It is a gift basket," Vance said. His voice dropped an octave. He was trying to sound authoritative. "We are closing a massive deal next week. The client's wife is having a birthday. My assistant picked it out." "Your assistant picked out $2,000 worth of silk from a boutique," Eleanor said. "Yes," Vance replied. He grabbed his leather briefcase from the chair. "Like I said, you do not understand corporate networking. You never have." Eleanor felt a cold knot form in her stomach. The first shard of a broken mirror. Something was deeply wrong. The pieces did not fit together. "I understand that $2,000 is a lot of money," Eleanor said. Vance sighed loudly. It was a heavy, theatrical sigh. It was designed to make her feel small. It was designed to make her feel foolish. "Eleanor, please," Vance said. He walked toward the hallway. "Do not do this today. I have a massive presentation. I carry the entire financial weight of this household. I do not have time for your paranoid delusions." He stopped at the door. He turned back to look at her. His eyes were cold and dismissive. "Go back to your little computer hobby," Vance said. "Let me handle the real work." The heavy oak front door slammed shut. The house fell dead silent. Eleanor stood alone in the kitchen. Her silk blouse felt tight across her chest. The cold draft from the window seemed to blow straight through her bones. She walked over to the trash can. She looked down at the crumpled ball of paper. She did not reach for it. She already knew what it said. $2,000. Purchased last Friday at 2:30 in the afternoon, a time when Vance claimed he was in a board meeting. Eleanor walked to the coffee pot. She poured the dark, bitter liquid down the drain. She watched it swirl into the metal grate. My husband is lying to me, she thought. The realization did not come with tears. It came with a profound sense of unease. It felt like stepping on a missing stair in the dark. Eleanor walked into the living room. She sat down on the white linen sofa. The house was spotless. It was a perfect upper-middle-class suburban home. It was exactly what Vance wanted. It was a stage for his success. She picked up her phone from the coffee table. She opened the family location sharing app. Vance had insisted on installing it years ago. He said it was for safety. Eleanor knew it was for control. She looked at his blue dot on the digital map. The dot was moving down the highway. It was heading toward the city. It was heading toward his corporate office. Eleanor stared at the screen. She pressed the screen. Refresh. The dot moved slightly. She waited 10 seconds. She pressed it again. Refresh. She waited another 10 seconds. Refresh. She sat alone in the quiet house, refreshing his location. 3 times. Lock the screen. Unlock the screen. Refresh. Lock, unlock. Refresh. I am acting crazy, she thought. Why am I doing this? She put the phone face down on the glass table. She rubbed her temples. A dull headache was beginning to form behind her eyes. She had been married to Vance since she was 28 years old. She was 48 now, 2 full decades. Over the years, she had learned to shrink herself. Vance needed to be the big man. He needed to be the provider. When they first met, Eleanor had been a brilliant software engineer. She was out-earning him. Vance hated it. He made endless passive-aggressive comments. He complained that her work hours were destroying their marriage. He said a real wife would prioritize the home. So Eleanor compromised. She quit her corporate job. She told Vance she was going to do some freelance consulting from home, a little hobby, just to keep her mind busy. Vance loved that idea. He loved being the sole breadwinner. He loved coming home and asking her how her little projects were going. He never actually listened to the answers. He just liked the dynamic. Eleanor stood up from the sofa. She walked down the long hallway toward her home office. The door was heavy solid wood. She closed it behind her. She locked it. This room was her sanctuary. It did not look like a little hobby room. It looked like a command center. 3 large computer monitors sat on a massive standing desk. A secure server rack hummed quietly in the corner. The walls were lined with whiteboards covered in complex algorithms and organizational charts. Eleanor sat down in her ergonomic chair. She woke up the screens. She was not a freelance consultant. She was the founder and chief executive officer of a remote tech security firm. She had built it entirely from this room. She had hired over 300 remote employees across the globe. Her company secured data for international banks. Her company protected medical records for entire hospital network. And yesterday morning, Eleanor had received a formal acquisition offer. A major tech conglomerate wanted to buy her company. The offer was staggering. It was for $1.2 billion. Vance had no idea. Vance thought she made maybe $30,000 a year. He thought her income paid for groceries and her own clothes. He had never once asked to see her tax returns. He filed separately. He liked keeping his money away from her. Eleanor looked at the flashing green cursor on her main monitor. The contract was waiting for her final review, but she could not focus on the billion-dollar contract. Her mind kept going back to the lingerie receipt. The phone on her desk buzzed. It was Beatrice. Eleanor picked it up. "Hello, Bea." "Morning, Elle," Beatrice said. Her voice was loud and energetic. The sound of clinking metal bowls echoed in the background. Beatrice owned a bakery downtown. "Are we still on for lunch at noon?" "I am not sure," Eleanor replied. "It has been a strange morning." "Strange how?" Beatrice asked. "Did Vance throw another tantrum about his dry cleaning?" "No," Eleanor said. "I found a credit card receipt for $2,000 at a luxury lingerie boutique." The line went silent for 3 seconds. The clinking of bowls stopped completely. "Excuse me?" Beatrice said. "Did you just say lingerie?" "Yes," Eleanor said. "What did that arrogant fool say when you confronted him?" Beatrice asked. "He said it was a corporate gift basket for a client's wife," Eleanor replied. She heard how ridiculous it sounded as she spoke the words aloud. Beatrice let out a harsh, bitter laugh. "A lingerie basket for a client's wife? Who is his client? Hugh Hefner?" "Eleanor, please tell me you did not believe that garbage." "I did not," Eleanor said, "but he was so aggressive about it. He wiped the iPad last week, too. I just remembered that." "He wiped the family iPad?" Beatrice asked. "Yes," Eleanor said. "He told me it was running slow. He did a full factory reset. All my photos of the garden were lost." "Eleanor," Beatrice said. Her voice was suddenly very serious. "My ex-husband did the exact same thing right before I caught him with his dental hygienist. He is hiding tracks." "You think he is a cheating husband?" Eleanor asked. The words tasted like ash in her mouth. "I think a man does not buy $2,000 worth of silk for a client," Beatrice said. "And I think Vance has been acting extremely arrogant lately. More than usual. He came into the bakery last week and barely looked at me." "I need to know for sure," Eleanor said. "Do not ask him again," Beatrice warned. "If he is a cheating husband, he will just gaslight you. He will call you crazy. He will make you feel like you are losing your mind." "He already did," Eleanor said quietly. "Look for the small things," Beatrice advised. "Hidden accounts, a second phone, check his car if you can." "He took his car to work," Eleanor said. "Then check his home office," Beatrice said. "I have to get these croissants in the oven. Call me the second you find something. Do not let him make you doubt your own sanity." "Thank you, Bea," Eleanor said. She hung up the phone. The home office was quiet again. The servers hummed. The air conditioner clicked on. Eleanor stood up from her desk. She walked back out into the hallway. She walked past the kitchen. She walked past the living room. She stood in front of the door to Vance's study. Vance always kept this door closed. He called it his executive space. He forbade Eleanor from cleaning it. He hired a private maid service to come once a month just for this room. Eleanor turned the brass doorknob. The door was locked. Vance had never locked this door before. The unease in her stomach hardened into a cold, heavy stone. Why lock the door inside your own house? What are you afraid your wife will see? Eleanor went to the kitchen. She opened the junk drawer. She dug past old batteries and rubber bands. She found the small silver master key they used for the interior doors. She walked back to his study. She slid the key into the lock. She turned it. It clicked. She pushed the door open. The room smelled of old leather and his expensive cologne. It was meticulously clean. The mahogany desk was perfectly organized. Books on sales tactics and corporate dominance lined the shelves. Eleanor walked to the desk. She did not know what she was looking for. She opened the top drawer. Pens, highlighters, a stack of pristine business cards. She opened the second drawer. Corporate files, blank legal pads. She opened the bottom drawer. It was mostly empty, just a few old tax returns. She closed the drawers. She stood in the center of the room. She felt foolish. Maybe she was paranoid. Maybe the stress of her billion-dollar buyout was making her project anxiety onto her marriage. She turned to leave the room. Then she saw it. Under the edge of the leather sofa in the corner, a small black rectangle was peeking out from the shadow. Eleanor walked over to the sofa. She knelt down on the plush wool rug. She reached under the leather frame. Her fingers brushed against smooth glass and cold metal. She pulled it out. It was an iPad. It was not the family iPad that Vance had factory reset last week. That iPad was silver. This one was matte black. It was a brand new model. Eleanor sat back on her heels. She stared at the device in her hands. She pressed the power button on the side. The screen lit up. It displayed a lock screen. The background image was not a generic computer wallpaper. It was a photograph. Eleanor stopped breathing. The air simply vanished from her lungs. The photograph showed Vance. He was smiling. It was a genuine, relaxed smile that Eleanor had not seen in a decade. His arm was wrapped tightly around the waist of a young woman. The woman was blonde. She looked to be about 29 years old. She was wearing a beautiful, expensive silk robe. A robe that looked exactly like it cost $2,000. They were standing on the balcony of a high-rise apartment. The city skyline stretched out behind them. They looked happy. They looked like a couple in love. Eleanor stared at the screen. She did not cry. She did not scream. She just stared at the face of the other woman. The screen timed out and went black. Eleanor saw her own reflection in the dark glass. She looked older. She looked tired. She looked like a woman who had spent 20 years shrinking herself for a man who was building a life with someone else. The iPad chimed in her hands. The screen lit up again. A new text message notification appeared across the lock screen. The sender was saved as Paige. The message read, "Did you tell her about the house yet? The realtor needs our deposit by Friday." Eleanor stared at this glowing white text. Our deposit. The house. He was not just having an affair. He was buying a house with the other woman. Eleanor placed the iPad gently on the leather sofa. She stood up. Her legs felt completely numb. The room seemed to be spinning very slowly. The paper tore. That was how the morning started. Now, her entire 20-year reality was tearing apart. A sharp, ugly sound echoing in her mind. She walked out of the study. She left the door open behind her. She walked down the hallway. She went back into her own locked office. She sat down in her ergonomic chair. She looked at the flashing green cursor on her computer monitor. $1.2 billion. Vance thought she was a useless housewife. Vance thought he held all the power. Vance thought he was going to discard her and move into a new house with his 29-year-old girlfriend. Eleanor took a slow, deep breath. The cold panic in her chest began to solidify. It turned into something else. It turned into absolute, terrifying clarity. She reached for her phone. She dialed a number from her private contacts list. The phone rang twice. "Harrison Legal?" A deep voice answered. "Harrison, it is Eleanor," she said. Her voice was perfectly steady. The trembling in her hands had completely stopped. "Good morning, Eleanor," Harrison replied. He was her corporate attorney. He was ruthless and brilliant. "Are you calling to finalize the buyout signatures?" "We are putting the buyout on a temporary hold," Eleanor said. "A hold?" Harrison asked. He sounded surprised. "The buyers are eager to close. Is there a problem?" "There's a problem," Eleanor replied. She looked out the window at the perfectly manicured suburban lawn. "I need you to run a quiet asset check on my husband. I need to know every hidden bank account he has. And I need the name of a young woman named Paige." "Are we discussing a corporate issue or a marital issue?" Harrison asked. His tone shifted immediately to strictly professional. "We are discussing a divorce," Eleanor said. "Understood," Harrison said. "I will have my investigators on it within the hour." "Do you want me to draft standard divorce papers?" "Not yet," Eleanor said. "I need to know exactly what he is trying to steal from me before I let him know I am watching. Eleanor, Harrison said gently. I am sorry. Do not be sorry, Eleanor said. Just be fast. She hung up the phone. The first shard of the broken mirror had cut her, but she was not going to bleed out. She was going to pick up the glass. She looked at the empty coffee cup on her desk. The game had changed. Vance thought he was playing against a naive housewife. He did not realize he was sitting across the table from a corporate titan, and she was going to let him keep believing that, right up until the very end. The sharp buzz vibrated against the cold marble counter. Eleanor stopped walking. She turned toward the master bathroom. The sound came again. It was a short, demanding vibration. She walked through the bedroom. The bed was perfectly made. Vance had left his smartwatch on the charging stand near the sink. He never forgot his watch. He must have been rushing this morning. Eleanor picked up the heavy metal watch. The screen glowed. A notification was sitting on the digital face. It was an alert from their joint bank. The text was small but entirely clear. Transfer of $50,000 complete. Destination account unknown. Eleanor stared at this tiny screen. $50,000. That was almost half of their liquid joint savings. It was the money they had saved for emergencies. She felt a strange floating sensation. The man she had slept next to for 20 years was gone. The man who kissed her forehead this morning was an illusion. She was looking at the actions of a complete stranger. Eleanor walked back to her home office. She sat down at her computer. She opened a secure browser window. She logged into their joint banking portal. She clicked on the savings tab. The balance loaded. It was devastatingly low. Vance had not just taken $50,000 today. He had been taking smaller amounts for months. $5,000 here, $8,000 there. He was slowly bleeding their shared life dry. He was moving it to an account she could not see. He was preparing to leave her with nothing. The phone on her desk rang. It startled her. She picked it up. Hello? Eleanor said. Her voice sounded hollow. I found out who she is, Beatrice said. Her friend sounded out of breath. I called my niece. She works in the same corporate building as Vance. Tell me, Eleanor replied. Her name is Paige, Beatrice said. She is 29 years old. She is a junior sales associate in his department. They have been working closely together for 6 months. Eleanor closed her eyes. 6 months. My niece saw them at the coffee shop downstairs yesterday, Beatrice continued. They were holding hands across the table. He was rubbing her knuckles. It is disgusting, Elle. He is a textbook cheating husband. He is buying a house with her, Eleanor said flatly. What? Beatrice asked. Her voice spiked in volume. How do you know that? I found a hidden iPad, Eleanor replied. She sent him a text about a deposit for a house, and he just transferred $50,000 out of our savings. Beatrice went completely silent. He is stealing from you, Beatrice finally said. Her voice was cold with anger. He is using your shared money to fund his new life. Yes, Eleanor said. He thinks I will not notice. He thinks I do not check the accounts because I trust him. You need to confront him, Beatrice said. You need to lock the accounts right now. No, Eleanor replied. She opened her eyes. The floating feeling vanished. A sharp, icy focus replaced it. If I lock the accounts, he will know I am watching. He will panic. He will hide things better. What are you going to do? Beatrice asked. I am going to let him think he is winning, Eleanor said. I have to go, Bea. I need to get out of this house. Eleanor hung up the phone. She grabbed her purse and her car keys. She walked out the front door. The bright afternoon sun felt harsh against her face. She climbed into her luxury SUV. She started the engine. She did not know where she was driving. She just drove. She drove past the manicured lawns of their neighborhood. She drove past the country club, where Vance played golf every Sunday. She drove past the grocery store where she bought his favorite steaks. Every landmark felt tainted. Every street corner held a memory of a marriage that was entirely fake. Who is this person? That was the question repeating in her mind. Vance was not just a cheating husband. He was a calculated thief. He was methodically dismantling their life behind her back. He was smiling at her over dinner while draining their bank accounts. She pulled the car back into her own driveway. She shifted the gear into park. She turned off the engine. She did not get out of the car. She sat in the driver's seat. Her hands gripped the leather steering wheel. She stared at the front door of her large, beautiful house. It felt like a trap. It felt like a crime scene. 4 minutes passed. The engine ticked softly as it began to cool down. Tick, tick, tick. The neighborhood was completely silent. A neighbor's sprinkler hissed in the distance. The sun beat down on the windshield. Eleanor felt the overwhelming weight of the betrayal pressing down on her chest. She wanted to scream. She wanted to break the glass, but she did not. Instead, she took a slow, deep breath. She loosened her grip on the steering wheel. I am not crazy. I know what I saw. She spoke the words aloud in the empty car. Her voice was firm. It was a declaration of truth. She was not the paranoid wife Vance claimed she was. She was wide awake. Eleanor opened the car door. She stepped out onto the concrete driveway. She walked toward the garage. She pressed the keypad on the wall. The heavy wooden garage door rolled up with a loud mechanical groan. She stepped into the cool, shadowed space of the garage. Vance's expensive set of golf clubs stood perfectly upright in the corner. He polished them every week. He treated them better than he treated her. He had told her he was going on a weekend golf trip with his friends next month. Eleanor walked over to the large leather golf bag. She reached for the large side pocket. She unzipped it. She found extra golf balls. She found a handful of wooden tees. She found a crumpled cigar wrapper. She reached for the long, narrow pocket on the other side. She pulled the zipper down. Her fingers brushed against thick, heavy paper. She pulled it out. It was a large brown manila envelope. There was no writing on the outside. It was thick and heavy. Eleanor opened the metal clasp. She slid the contents out into her hands. It was a stack of legal documents. Printed across the top of the first page were the words, "Petition for Dissolution of Marriage." They were drafted divorce papers. Eleanor stared at the black ink on the white paper. He had already hired a lawyer. He had already drafted the paperwork. He was preparing to file the documents before she even knew there was a problem. She flipped to the second page. It was the proposed division of assets. Eleanor read the paragraphs carefully. Her legal knowledge from her corporate work made the complex language easy to understand. Vance was asking for full ownership of the house. He was asking for full control of his retirement accounts. He was claiming that the joint savings were primarily his earnings. He was offering her a small, insulting lump sum of money. He was offering her the old minivan. He was trying to erase her completely. Eleanor felt a cold smile touch the corners of her mouth. It was not a smile of happiness. It was a smile of pure, dark realization. Vance thought she was weak. Vance thought she was entirely dependent on him. He had no idea that she had a team of corporate lawyers on retainer. He had no idea she had just finalized a billion-dollar company sale. He had no idea she was holding all the power. Eleanor carefully slid the divorce papers back into the brown envelope. She placed the envelope back into the narrow pocket of the golf bag. She zipped it closed. She left the golf bag, looking exactly as she found it. She walked out of the garage. The air felt different now. The shock was gone. The disorientation was fading. Vance was a stranger. He was a cruel, selfish stranger. But Eleanor was starting to remember exactly who she was. She walked into the house. She went straight to her home office. She sat down in her ergonomic chair. She looked at her computer screens. The green cursor was still flashing on the billion-dollar contract. She picked up her phone. She dialed Harrison's number again. He answered on the first ring. Eleanor, I have preliminary results. Tell me, Eleanor said. He opened a private checking account 3 months ago, Harrison reported. He transferred $50,000 into it this morning. He also signed a lease agreement on a luxury condo downtown yesterday. I know, Eleanor replied. I also found drafted divorce papers hidden in his golf bag. He plans to blindside me. Harrison paused. That is aggressive. Do you want me to file first? We can hit him with a massive subpoena by tomorrow morning. No, Eleanor said firmly. Eleanor, Harrison warned, if he files first, he controls the initial narrative. I do not care about the narrative, Eleanor said. I care about the end game. If we fight him now, he will demand full financial discovery. He will see the tech company. He will see the billion-dollar buyout. You are right, Harrison agreed. His voice was heavy. If he knows about your company, he will drag this out in court for years. He will claim he supported you while you built it. He will try to take half of your empire. He will never touch my company, Eleanor said. Her voice was hard as steel. We built it without a single dollar of his money. We built it while he ignored me. So what is the strategy? Harrison asked. We let him win the small game, Eleanor said. Let him serve the papers. Let him demand the house. Let him hide his petty cash. You want to sign away your rights to the marital assets? Harrison asked. He sounded shocked. I want to sign a clean, uncontested divorce, Eleanor replied. I want it finalized as fast as legally possible. I will give him the house. I will give him the savings. I will walk away looking like a defeated housewife. Eleanor, that is incredibly risky, Harrison said. It is the only way to protect the $1 billion, Eleanor said. We finalize the divorce, the ink dries, he gets his mediocre life, and then we sign the buyout contract. Harrison laughed softly. It was a deep, respectful sound. You are going to let him dig his own grave. I am going to hand him the shovel, Eleanor said. Get the paperwork ready, Harrison. When he serves me, I want to surrender immediately. Understood, Madam CEO, Harrison said. Eleanor hung up the phone. She looked at her reflection in the dark monitor of her computer. The stranger she married thought he was playing a brilliant game of chess. He did not realize Eleanor owned the entire board. She turned back to her work. She had an empire to run, and she had a divorce to plan. The heavy brass hinge creaked. Eleanor lifted the lid of the old cedar chest. A small cloud of dust danced in the morning sunlight. The sharp scent of dried lavender and aged paper filled the quiet bedroom. She reached deep into the wooden trunk. Her hands brushed past folded winter sweaters. She pulled out a thick leather journal. It was 20 years old. It belonged to a completely different woman. Eleanor sat on the edge of the bed. She opened the heavy cover. The pages were filled with messy, hurried handwriting. It was the handwriting of a 28-year-old software engineer. She read an entry from the week before her wedding. Vance wants me to cut my hours, she had written. He says my ambition makes him feel inadequate. I love him. I will compromise. I can always build my code in the background. Eleanor traced the faded blue ink with her finger. She turned another page. Vance laughed at my new project today, the old entry read. He called it a cute little hobby. It hurt. But I will stay quiet. A good wife supports her husband. Eleanor closed the book. The leather felt cold against her skin. She did not feel angry at Vance in this moment. She felt a profound, heavy grief for herself. She grieved the bright, loud woman she used to be. She had traded her voice for a quiet marriage. I sacrificed my own light to make him feel tall. She spoke the truth out loud. The bedroom absorbed the words. It was a simple, devastating fact. Eleanor stood up. She walked into the master bathroom. The bright vanity lights flickered on. She looked at her pale face in the mirror. She felt entirely hollow. She needed armor. She opened her cosmetic drawer. She picked up a glass bottle of liquid foundation. She applied it carefully to her skin. She reached for a brush. She added blush to her cheeks. She coated her eyelashes with dark mascara. She applied a bold red lipstick. She spent 20 minutes perfecting her face. Then she walked out the front door. She walked down the concrete driveway. She opened the metal mailbox. She pulled out a stack of grocery store flyers. She turned around and walked back inside. She had put on a full face of makeup just to go to the mailbox. It was a desperate attempt to feel normal. It was a physical routine to hold her shattering mind together. She placed the mail on the kitchen counter. She picked up her purse. It was time to face the reality of her future. 40 minutes later, Eleanor walked into a high-rise office building downtown. The glass doors slid open with a soft hum. The lobby smelled of expensive coffee and floor wax. Her heels clicked sharply against the polished granite floor. She rode the elevator to the 50th floor. The silver doors opened. The receptionist smiled at her. "Good morning, Eleanor," the receptionist said. "Mr. Harrison is waiting for you in the main conference room." Eleanor walked down the long, carpeted hallway. She pushed open the heavy oak door to the conference room. The room was vast. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the bustling city. The distant hum of traffic vibrated through the thick glass. Harrison sat at the head of a massive mahogany table. He wore a dark blue suit. He was 55 years old. He had sharp gray eyes and a completely ruthless reputation. He was her corporate lawyer. Today, he was officially acting as her divorce attorney. "Sit down, Eleanor," Harrison said. He pointed to the leather chair across from him. Eleanor sat down. The leather creaked under her weight. Harrison pushed a thick file folder across the smooth wood table. "My private investigators worked through the night," Harrison said. "Vance has been very busy. He is entirely financially entangled with Paige." "Show me," Eleanor said. Harrison opened the folder. He laid out a series of glossy photographs and printed bank statements. "He signed the lease for the luxury condo 3 days ago," Harrison said. "He paid 6 months of rent upfront in cash. The cash came from the $50,000 he stole from your joint savings." Eleanor stared at a photograph of the condo building. It was modern and sleek. It was the exact opposite of their suburban home. "He also bought her a car," Harrison added. He tapped a printed loan agreement. "A new convertible." He co-signed the loan. He listed his income as the primary household income. Eleanor felt a cold wave of disgust wash over her. "He is preparing to serve the divorce papers by the end of the week," Harrison said. "His lawyer is aggressive. They want to leave you completely destitute." "I saw the drafted divorce papers in his golf bag," Eleanor replied. "He wants the house. He wants the remaining savings. He is offering me the old minivan and a tiny lump sum." "It is standard bullying tactics," Harrison said. He leaned back in his chair. "He assumes you have no money to fight him. He assumes you will panic and accept the terrible offer." Eleanor looked out the massive windows. The city looked small from up here. "If we fight him on the splitting assets process, what happens?" Eleanor asked. Harrison folded his hands on the table. His face grew very serious. "If we contest the division of assets, we enter the discovery phase," Harrison explained. "A judge will order a full audit of both of your financial histories, every bank account, every business interest, everything." The room went completely silent. The hum of the city traffic faded away. "They will find my company," Eleanor said quietly. "Yes," Harrison replied. They will find the tech firm. They will see that you are the sole owner, and they will see the pending acquisition offer for $1.2 billion. Eleanor felt her chest tighten. If Vance sees that money, he will never let you go, Harrison said. He will claim marital property. He will argue that his job paid the bills while you built the business. He will tie you up in litigation for 5 years. He could potentially take half. Eleanor closed her eyes. She thought about the long nights writing code in her locked office. She thought about the stress of managing 300 employees. She had built her empire entirely in the shadows. Vance had mocked her work every single day. Now his betrayal threatened to destroy everything she had created. She had to choose between her dignity and her security. Both felt impossible to lose, but her peace of mind was the only currency that mattered now. I will not let him touch my life's work, Eleanor said. She opened her eyes. They were hard and clear. I will not give him a single dime of my real money. Then we have to be incredibly careful, Harrison said. If I sign his terrible divorce papers, does he forfeit his right to my future assets? Eleanor asked. Yes, Harrison replied. If you sign a legally binding settlement agreeing to his terms, the marriage is financially severed. Once the judge stamps the final decree, the assets are permanently split. Anything you acquire after that exact moment is yours alone. Eleanor nodded slowly. The path forward was becoming clear. He wants to play a game, Eleanor said. He wants to feel powerful by leaving me with nothing. Harrison reached into his leather briefcase. He pulled out a fresh blue folder. This is the counter strategy, Harrison said. He slid the blue folder across the polished mahogany desk. Eleanor looked at the plain blue cover. Let him think he won, Harrison said softly. Eleanor opened the folder. Inside was a timeline. It was a precise, aggressive schedule designed to finalize a divorce in record time. We do not fight him on anything, Harrison explained. When his lawyer demands the house, you cry and agree. When they demand the savings, you beg and then agree. We make them think you are a terrified, broken woman. I play the victim, Eleanor said. You play the role he expects you to play, Harrison corrected. You feed his massive ego. You let him think he is a financial genius outsmarting his naive wife. Eleanor traced the edge of the paper with her thumb. It was a brilliant, humiliating plan. He will gloat, Eleanor said. He will parade Paige around. He will make sure all our friends know he left me with nothing. Yes, he will, Harrison agreed. It will be incredibly painful. You will have to swallow your pride for 3 weeks. 3 weeks? Eleanor asked. I can fast-track the paperwork through a private judge, Harrison said. We can bypass the public courts. If both parties agree to the terms completely, we can finalize the decree in exactly 21 days. Eleanor looked at the timeline again. 21 days? 3 weeks of acting like a defeated fool. And the billion-dollar buyout? Eleanor asked. I have spoken with other buyers, Harrison said. They are willing to pause the final signatures for exactly 1 month. They do not want the messy liability of a divorce either. They will wait. Eleanor closed the blue folder. 3 weeks of humiliation, Eleanor said, in exchange for complete freedom. And total financial victory, Harrison added. Eleanor stood up from the leather chair. She picked up the blue folder. She held it tightly against her chest. Draft the response, Eleanor said. Her voice was steady and strong. When he serves the divorce papers, I will surrender completely. We will rush the splitting assets process. We will give him exactly what he wants. Harrison stood up as well. He offered his hand. It takes immense strength to play weak, Harrison said. Eleanor shook his hand. His grip was firm. I have spent 20 years playing weak for his comfort, Eleanor replied. I can do it for 3 more weeks, for my freedom. She turned and walked out of the conference room. She walked down the long hallway. She rode the elevator back down to the lobby. She stepped out into the bright afternoon sun. The city noise washed over her. Cars honked. People rushed past her on the sidewalk. Eleanor walked toward her car. The heavy grief from the morning was gone. The memory of the young, ambitious woman in the journal no longer made her sad. That woman was not dead. She had just been sleeping. Eleanor unlocked her car. She sat in the driver's seat. She looked at herself in the rearview mirror. The red lipstick was still perfectly in place. It did not look like desperate armor anymore. It looked like war paint. She started the engine. She pulled out into the heavy city traffic. Vance was going to get exactly what he asked for. He was going to get a fast divorce. He was going to get the house. He was going to get the small bank account. And then he was going to learn the most expensive lesson of his entire life. Tick, tick, tick. The heavy brass pendulum of the antique grandfather clock swung back and forth. It chopped the quiet evening into exact, relentless seconds. Eleanor sat on the long white linen sofa. She wore a heavy gray wool sweater. The fabric felt tight and incredibly itchy against her skin. She pulled at the collar. She felt suffocated in her own living room. The front door opened. Vance walked inside. He dropped his leather briefcase onto the floor. The heavy thud echoed through the foyers. He walked into the living room. A wave of his signature heavy cologne hit Eleanor first. But underneath the expensive pine scent, there was something else. It was a cheap, overly sweet floral smell. It was the scent of the other woman. Vance did not sit next to her on the sofa. He chose the single leather armchair across the coffee table. He sat on the edge of the cushion. He leaned his elbows on his knees. He looked at her with a practiced expression of deep sorrow. "We need to talk," Vance said. His voice was low and serious. It sounded entirely rehearsed. "Okay," Eleanor replied. She kept her hands folded in her lap. She let her shoulders slump slightly. She was beginning the performance. Vance took a deep, theatrical breath. "I am not happy, Eleanor," Vance said. "I have not been happy for a very long time. This marriage is draining the life out of me." Eleanor watched his face. She searched for a flicker of genuine emotion. She found nothing. He looked like an actor reciting lines from a bad television show. "What do you mean?" Eleanor asked. She made her voice sound small and fragile. "You are too emotionally dependent," Vance said. He pointed an accusatory finger at her. "You have no life of your own. You just sit in that home office playing with your little computer projects. You rely on me for absolutely everything." Eleanor felt a cold wave of pure disappointment. Layer 4 of the mirror spiral revealed itself. She had spent 20 years fearing this man's anger. She had respected his authority. But looking at him now, she realized something profound. He was not a monster. He was not a mastermind. He was just a small, cowardly man going through a very predictable midlife crisis. "I rely on you?" Eleanor asked softly. "Yes," Vance said quickly. He stood up from the chair. He began to pace across the rug. "You suffocate me, Eleanor. I need space to grow. I need to be around people who understand ambition. I am carrying the entire financial weight of this family." He was using Darvo tactics. Deny, attack. Reverse the roles of victim and offender. He was a cheating husband trying to blame his wife for his own betrayal. "So, what are you saying?" Eleanor asked. She looked down at her hands. "I am saying I want a divorce," Vance said. The words hung in the air. The clock ticked. Vance stopped pacing. He looked at her closely. He was waiting for her to break down. He was waiting for her to cry and beg him to stay. Eleanor forced a single tear to form in her left eye. She let it roll down her cheek. A divorce? Eleanor whispered. But Vance, what will I do? Where will I go? Vance sighed. It was that same heavy, patronizing sigh from the morning. I have already spoken to a lawyer, Vance said. He reached inside his jacket pocket. He pulled out a folded white document. I had them draft some preliminary papers today. Eleanor knew he was lying. Those papers had been hidden in his golf bag for weeks, but she acted completely shocked. Today? Eleanor asked. Her voice trembled perfectly. You did this today? I have to protect my assets, Vance said firmly. He tossed the folded papers onto the glass coffee table. They slid across the smooth surface and stopped near her knee. The proposal is more than fair. You can keep the minivan. I will give you a small lump sum to help you find an apartment. And the house? Eleanor asked. She picked up the papers with shaking hands. I am keeping the house, Vance said. His tone was sharp and final. I paid for it. It is my equity, and I am keeping the joint savings. You have not contributed a single real dollar to those accounts in 20 years. Eleanor looked at the printed words. She felt the tight, itchy wool of her sweater. She felt the mundane reality of his greed. He was willing to throw away 2 decades of history for $50,000 and a suburban house. It was pathetic. This is so fast, Vance, Eleanor said. She wiped her cheek. Can we just go to counseling? Can we try to fix this? There is nothing to fix, Vance said coldly. I am done, Eleanor. If you try to fight me on the splitting assets process, my lawyer will destroy you in court. You will end up with absolutely nothing. Sign the papers. Let us make this clean. I need time to read them, Eleanor said. She held the papers against her chest. You have until Friday, Vance said. I'm going upstairs to pack a bag. I'm going to stay at a hotel for a few days to give you space. He turned around and walked out of the living room. His heavy footsteps faded as he climbed the wooden stairs. Eleanor sat perfectly still on the sofa. The tear on her cheek dried. She did not feel sad. She felt a deep, terrifying emptiness. The man she loved had never actually existed. He was just a mask. Somewhere along the way, I became invisible. She whispered the affirmation to the empty room. It was true. She had made herself invisible so he could shine. Now she was going to use that invisibility as a weapon. Her cell phone buzzed in her pocket. It was a sharp, vibrating sound against her hip. Eleanor pulled the phone out. The caller identification displayed the name Clara. It was Vance's mother. Eleanor took a deep breath. She pressed the green button to accept the call. She held the phone to her ear. Hello, Clara, Eleanor said. Her voice was flat. Eleanor, Clara said loudly. Her voice was raspy from decades of smoking. Vance just texted me. He said he finally told you. Yes, Eleanor replied. He just gave me the drafted divorce papers. Well, it is a tragedy, Clara said. She did not sound sad at all. She sounded energized. But we all know this has been coming for a long time. You and Vance were never a good match. Eleanor gripped the phone tighter. Clara had always hated her. Clara thought her son was a king who deserved a supermodel, not a quiet software engineer. 20 years is a long time, Clara, Eleanor said softly. Do not make this difficult for him, Eleanor, Clara snapped. He works incredibly hard. He deserves to be happy. He deserves a woman who can keep up with his lifestyle. Eleanor frowned. The wording was strange. A woman who can keep up with him? Eleanor asked. The line was quiet for a brief moment. Clara had realized her mistake, but she was too arrogant to back down. Well, yes, Clara said defensively. A younger woman, someone with energy. Vance introduced me to his new colleague, Paige, last week. She is a lovely girl, very bright, very ambitious. The room seemed to drop in temperature. Eleanor stared at the ticking grandfather clock. Clara knew. Her mother-in-law had met the other woman. Her mother-in-law had sat across a table from the 29-year-old mistress and smiled. And then Clara had called her daughter-in-law to tell her to make the divorce easy. The betrayal was not just Vance. It was his entire family. "You met Paige," Eleanor stated. It was not a question. "Vance brought her to lunch," Clara said. Her tone was completely unapologetic. "It was strictly professional at the time, of course, but you can see the connection. Do not be bitter, Eleanor. Men have needs. You let yourself go. You chose your little home office over his happiness." Eleanor felt the anger rise in her chest. It was hot and bright. She wanted to scream at the old woman. She wanted to tell Clara about the billion-dollar company. She wanted to tell Clara that her precious son was stealing money from a joint bank account because he was actually broke. But Harrison's voice echoed in her mind. Let him think he won. Eleanor swallowed the hot anger. She let it turn back into cold, hard ice. "I understand, Clara," Eleanor said. Her voice sounded broken and defeated. It was a perfect performance. "I will not fight him. I will sign whatever he wants. I just want peace." Clara let out a satisfied huff. "That is the smartest thing you have ever done," Clara said. "Pack his things carefully. Do not wrinkle his suits." The line clicked dead. Eleanor slowly lowered the phone to her lap. The ticking of the grandfather clock filled the silence again. Tick, tick, tick. She looked down at the divorce papers on the glass table. Vance and his mother thought they had broken her. They thought they were discarding a useless, invisible woman. They were so blinded by their own arrogance that they could not see the trap closing around them. Eleanor stood up from the sofa. She picked up the divorce papers. She walked into the kitchen. She poured herself a tall glass of cold water. She drank it slowly. The cold water washed away the dry, bitter taste in her mouth. She heard Vance carrying a heavy leather suitcase down the stairs. She walked back into the hallway. Vance stood by the front door. He looked handsome in his tailored suit. He looked eager to leave. He was going straight to the luxury condo he had rented with their stolen money. He was going straight to Paige. "I am leaving now," Vance said. He did not look her in the eye. "Have the papers signed by Friday. I will have my lawyer pick them up." "Vance," Eleanor said softly. He stopped with his hand on the brass doorknob. He turned his head slightly. "What?" Vance asked impatiently. "I am sorry I could not be the wife you needed," Eleanor said. Vance puffed out his chest. His ego inflated visibly. He felt like a king. "Some people just cannot handle the pressure of success, Eleanor," Vance said. "Take care of yourself." He opened the heavy oak door. He walked out into the cool evening air. The door clicked shut behind him. Eleanor stood alone in the quiet hallway. She waited until she heard the engine of his sports car start. She waited until the sound of the tires faded down the street. Then she smiled. It was a wide, genuine, terrifying smile. She walked back to her home office. She unlocked the heavy door. She sat down in her ergonomic chair. She woke up the computer monitors. The green cursor blinked on the $1.2 billion acquisition contract. She picked up her cell phone. She texted Harrison. The text message read, "He gave me the papers. His mother knows everything. I am ready to sign his terrible deal tomorrow morning. Let the game begin." She placed the phone face down on the desk. She had 3 weeks to play the victim. 3 weeks of acting small. 3 weeks of being the predictable, discarded wife. And on day 22, she was going to buy an airplane. The heavy brass knocker pounded against the front door. 3 loud, sharp strikes. Eleanor walked down the hallway. She opened the door. Beatrice stood on the concrete porch. The bright morning sun illuminated her face. She looked tired. She held a pink cardboard pastry box in one hand. She held a thick yellow envelope in the other. I brought you croissants, Beatrice said. Her voice was flat. And I brought you reality. Come inside, Eleanor replied. They walked into the kitchen. The house smelled faintly of lemon floor polish. Beatrice set the pastry box on the marble island. The cardboard scraped softly against the stone. My niece works near the new luxury condo, Beatrice said. She tore open the yellow envelope. She saw them yesterday afternoon. She took these on her phone. Beatrice slid a stack of glossy printed photographs across the counter. Eleanor picked them up. The photo paper felt smooth and cold. The first picture showed Vance and Paige inside a high-end furniture store. They were standing in front of a white, leather sectional sofa. Vance had his arm around her shoulders. He was pointing at a matching glass coffee table. Paige was smiling. She looked smug. She looked like a woman who believed she had won a grand prize. Eleanor stared at the image. She expected to feel a surge of hot jealousy. She expected her hands to shake, but her hands remained perfectly still. She looked closely at Vance. He was wearing his weekend casual clothes. He looked slightly foolish. He was 50 years old, trying very hard to act 29. He looked tired around the eyes. He looked exactly like every other middle-aged, cheating husband trying to buy his youth back. It was utterly mundane. They look pathetic, Eleanor said quietly. Beatrice let out a long breath. She sounded relieved. I was terrified you would cry, Beatrice said. I have no tears left for him, Eleanor replied. She flipped to the next photograph. It showed Vance handing a thick stack of cash to the furniture salesman. That is my money. He is buying her a couch with the emergency fund we saved together. Are you still going to let him get away with it? Beatrice asked. Her voice rose in frustration. I am going to let him think he got away with it, Eleanor said. She placed the photos face down on the marble. I signed the divorce papers this morning. Harrison sent them to Vance's lawyer an hour ago. Beatrice stared at her. Her mouth fell open slightly. You signed them? Beatrice asked. You just gave him everything? I gave him the house and the depleted savings accounts, Eleanor said. I played the terrified victim perfectly. His lawyer actually laughed at me on the phone. They think I surrendered because I have no money to fight. Eleanor, starting over at 48 with nothing is impossible, Beatrice said. She sounded deeply worried. I will not be starting over with nothing, Eleanor said softly. She reached out and squeezed her friend's hand. I am starting over with everything. You just have to trust me, Bea. In 3 weeks, the ink will dry. The trap will close. Beatrice looked at her closely. She saw the iron resolve in Eleanor's eyes. You terrify me sometimes, Beatrice said. She opened the pink pastry box. The rich smell of butter and sugar filled the air. Eat a croissant. You look too thin. Thank you, Bea, Eleanor replied. 10 hours later, the house was dark. The grandfather clock in the living room chimed midnight. 12 low, echoing bells. Eleanor stood alone in the kitchen. She wore loose cotton pajamas. The house was completely silent. The quiet was heavy. It pressed against her ears. She felt a sudden, suffocating wave of anxiety. It was not about the divorce. It was about the loss of structure. For 20 years, her life had run on Vance's schedule. Breakfast at 6, dinner at 7, laundry on Sundays. Now the schedule was gone. The empty space felt massive and terrifying. She did what she always did when her world was collapsing. She cleaned. She opened the large pantry door. The hinges squeaked slightly. She reached for the top shelf. She pulled down a large plastic bin filled with glass spice jars. She carried the heavy bin to the kitchen island. She took a deep breath. She needed control. She needed order. She emptied the bin onto the counter. 50 tiny glass jars clinked together. She began to wipe each jar with a damp cloth. She arranged them in a perfect, straight line. She organized them by strict alphabetical order: allspice, basil, cardamom, cinnamon, cloves. The pungent smell of dried basil mixed with the warm, sweet scent of cinnamon. The aromas grounded her. The physical action of turning the jars so the labels faced forward was incredibly soothing. She spent 3 full minutes doing nothing but aligning the small glass bottles. Perfect, controllable order in a house filled with chaos. Control in a jar. When the last jar of turmeric was perfectly in place, her breathing had slowed. Her heart rate had returned to normal. She left the pristine spice rack on the counter. She walked slowly down the hallway toward the master bedroom. She opened the door. The large king-size bed looked vast and empty in the moonlight. Eleanor walked to her side of the mattress. She pulled back the heavy down comforter. She sat down on the edge of the bed. She looked at Vance's side. The pillows were perfectly smooth. The sheets were cold. She tried to swing her legs up. She tried to lie down in the center of the bed, but her body refused to move past the invisible line in the middle of the mattress. She was completely unable to lie down on his side. The physical habit of 20 years was carved into her muscles. She was a woman who had learned to take up as little space as possible. She sat on the very edge of the mattress. Her feet touched the cold, hardwood floor. It was a terrifyingly lonely moment. She did not cry. She just stared at the empty space where her husband used to sleep. She realized how much energy she had spent keeping him comfortable. She pulled the comforter up over her shoulders. She lay on her side, perfectly still, until the sun began to rise. The next morning, Eleanor stood in Vance's massive walk-in closet. The air smelled faintly of cedar wood and shoe polish. She held a stack of heavy cardboard moving boxes. She dropped them onto the plush carpet. It was time to pack his remaining things. He had texted her to demand his custom Italian suits and his expensive watch collection. Eleanor grabbed a roll of clear packing tape. The tape ripped off the roll with a loud, aggressive screech. She pulled his dark blue wool suit off the wooden hanger. She folded it roughly. She tossed it into the cardboard box. She did not care if it wrinkled. She pulled down his silk ties. She threw them into the box. Red silk, blue silk, silver silk. They landed in a messy pile. She felt a strange sense of liberation. She was dismantling his shrine. She was physically removing his presence from her home. The telephone on her home office desk began to ring. It was a sharp, urgent electronic chirp. It was the secure line. Eleanor dropped a handful of leather belts into the box. She walked out of the closet. She walked down the hallway to her office. She unlocked the heavy wooden door. She picked up the receiver. "Eleanor speaking," she said. "Good morning, Madam CEO," a professional male voice answered. It was Marcus, her chief financial officer. He was calling from the corporate headquarters 3 states away. "Good morning, Marcus," Eleanor replied. She sat down in her chair. "I am calling to confirm the results of the emergency board meeting," Marcus said. His voice buzzed with suppressed excitement. "The board of directors voted 30 minutes ago." Eleanor held her breath. The room was perfectly silent. "The vote was unanimous," Marcus reported. "The buyers formally accepted our final terms. The acquisition is fully approved. The funds have been placed in a secure holding escrow." Eleanor closed her eyes. A massive wave of relief washed over her. $1.2 billion, Marcus said. He spoke the words slowly, respectfully. "Congratulations, Eleanor. You built an absolute empire." "Thank you, Marcus," Eleanor said. Her voice trembled just slightly. "Is the waiting period confirmed?" "Yes," Marcus replied. "The buyers agreed to Harrison's request. We are pausing the final ink on the transfer documents for exactly 20 days. The money will sit perfectly untouched in escrow until your legal situation is resolved." "No one knows?" Eleanor asked. "We are under a strict non-disclosure agreement," Marcus said. The public announcement will happen next month. Right now, on paper, you still only own a private, unvalued tech startup. Perfect, Eleanor said. Eleanor, if I may ask, Marcus said hesitantly. Harrison mentioned your husband is pushing an aggressive settlement. Are you entirely safe? I am entirely safe, Marcus, Eleanor replied. She looked at the flashing cursor on her monitor. My husband thinks he is punishing me. He thinks I am a naive woman who lost her only source of income. He is going to be incredibly surprised, Marcus said. He laughed softly. Yes, he is, Eleanor said. Prepare the final transfer documents for the 22nd of the month. I will be ready to sign. Eleanor hung up the secure phone. She stood up from her desk. She walked over to the large window. She looked out at the quiet suburban street. A bright yellow moving truck drove slowly past her house. She was officially worth over $1 billion. Her company was sold. Her legacy was secure. The money was waiting in a digital vault. And her husband was currently sitting in a rented condo, feeling proud of himself for stealing $50,000 from a joint checking account. Eleanor walked back to the master bedroom. She went straight to his closet. She picked up the clear packing tape. She pulled it across the top of the cardboard box, holding his expensive suits. The tape ripped loudly. She pressed it down, flat. She picked a thick, black marker from his desk. She wrote his name across the top of the box in large, messy letters. She pushed the heavy box out into the hallway. It scraped loudly against the floorboards. Starting over did not feel impossible anymore. It felt like standing at the edge of a massive, open horizon. She had 2 weeks left to play the broken wife. 2 weeks left to let him gloat. She grabbed another empty box. She went back into the closet to pack the rest of his garbage. The silver elevator doors slid open with a soft chime. Eleanor stepped out into the law firm lobby. The air conditioning was freezing. It made the skin on her arms pebble with goosebumps. The lobby smelled heavily of lemon air freshener and fresh newspaper ink. Harrison walked beside her. He carried his thick leather briefcase. They are in conference room 3, the receptionist said. She pointed down the long hallway. Eleanor stopped walking. Sitting on a white leather sofa in the waiting area was Paige. The 29-year-old mistress was scrolling on her phone. She wore a bright red designer dress. The fabric looked incredibly expensive. She had a smug, relaxed smile on her face. She looked up. Her eyes met Eleanor's eyes. Paige did not look away. She did not look ashamed. She simply stared back with a look of absolute victory. Keep walking, Eleanor, Harrison whispered. Do not engage. Eleanor nodded. She walked past the sofa. She did not say a single word. They reached conference room 3. Harrison opened the heavy frosted glass door. Vance sat at the long mahogany table. He wore his favorite Italian suit. His divorce attorney sat next to him. The lawyer was a small, sharp-looking man with slicked back hair. Good morning, Harrison said. He pulled out a leather chair for Eleanor. Eleanor sat down. The chair squeaked loudly. Vance did not say good morning. He crossed his arms over his chest. He looked at Eleanor with a mixture of pity and annoyance. Let us make this quick, Vance said. I have a flight to catch this afternoon, a weekend trip. With Paige, Eleanor thought, paid for with my stolen money. We are here to finalize the splitting assets process, Vance's lawyer said. He opened a thick manila folder. My client is offering a very generous settlement to avoid court. Harrison placed his hands flat on the table. Define generous. The opposing lawyer slid a piece of paper across the wood. Mr. Vance will retain full ownership of the primary residence, the lawyer read. He will assume all equity. He will also retain full ownership of his corporate retirement accounts and the joint checking accounts. Eleanor stared at the paper. It was exactly what she had seen in the drafted divorce papers. And my client? Harrison asked. His voice was dangerously calm. Your client will receive the 2012 minivan, the lawyer said smoothly. She will also receive a one-time payment of $10,000 to secure a rental apartment. That is the final offer. $10,000. After 20 years of marriage. Eleanor looked across the table at Vance. Layer 5 of the emotional spiral opened up inside her. It was the terrifying abyss of letting go. She was watching 2 decades of shared history being erased for $10,000. She looked at his hands resting on the table. She remembered those hands. They were the exact same hands that had built their daughter's wooden crib 18 years ago. She remembered him sanding the wood perfectly smooth so the baby would not get splinters. She remembered his hands holding hers in the hospital. Now, those hands were holding an expensive silver pen. They were waiting to sign away her entire existence. It was a profound, suffocating emptiness. The hardest part is admitting I knew from the beginning. She whispered the affirmation in her own mind. She had seen the signs for years, the late nights, the hidden passwords, the casual cruelty. She had chosen to be blind. That offer is completely unacceptable, Harrison said loudly. He played his part perfectly. My client is entitled to half the equity in that house. Vance slammed his hand on the table. The sound echoed like a gunshot in the small room. She did not pay for that house, Vance shouted. I worked 80-hour weeks. I climbed the corporate ladder. She sat at home playing on her computer. I am not giving her my hard-earned money. She supported your career, Harrison argued. I want the remaining investments too, Vance demanded. He pointed a finger at Eleanor. The mutual funds in the secondary account. I want them transferred to my name today. Eleanor felt the air leave the room. He was taking every last dime of the visible money. Vance, please, Eleanor said. She made her voice tremble. She forced her eyes to widen in panic. I will have nothing. How will I pay for health insurance? Vance leaned back in his chair. He looked incredibly satisfied. He loved seeing her beg. You should have thought about that before you became a dead weight, Vance said coldly. You are an adult, Eleanor. Get a real job. The cruelty was absolute. Eleanor looked at Harrison. She let a single dramatic tear fall down her cheek. Harrison looked back at her. He gave a very slow, almost imperceptible nod. It was the signal. I cannot fight you, Eleanor whispered. She looked down at her hands. I just want this over. I cannot afford to go to court. Vance's lawyer smiled like a shark smelling blood. A wise decision, the lawyer said. He pulled out the final decree. He pushed it across the table toward Harrison. Sign here to waive the right to financial discovery. Sign here to accept the settlement. Harrison picked up the papers. He pretended to look disgusted. He sighed heavily. Eleanor, as your divorce attorney, I must advise against this, Harrison said, clearly for the record. I accept the deal, Eleanor said softly. I just want him out of my life. Vance laughed. It was a short, victorious sound. You see, Vance said to his lawyer, I told you she would fold. She has zero backbone. Harrison handed Eleanor a pen. She took it. Her hand shook slightly, entirely on purpose. She signed her name on the preliminary agreement. She agreed to take the old van. She agreed to take the $10,000. She gave him the house and the savings. She slid the paper back across the table. The judge will review this tomorrow, Vance's lawyer said. He quickly packed the papers into his briefcase. We will schedule the final signing of the absolute decree for Friday afternoon. Friday is fine, Harrison said coldly. Vance stood up. He buttoned his suit jacket. He looked down at Eleanor. I am renting a plane on Friday afternoon, Vance said. I am flying Paige to a vineyard for the weekend. Have your lawyer bring the final papers to the private airfield at 3 o'clock. You can sign them on the tarmac before I leave. He wanted an audience. He wanted to humiliate her in public. "I will be there," Eleanor said quietly. Vance turned and walked out of the conference room. His lawyer followed closely behind him. The heavy glass door swung shut. Eleanor and Harrison were left alone in the cold room. The sound of Vance's footsteps faded down the hallway. Eleanor reached up and wiped the fake tear from her cheek. She sat up straight in her chair. The trembling in her hands stopped instantly. "He took the bait," Harrison said softly. He smiled. "He swallowed the hook completely," Eleanor replied. Her voice was pure steel. "He just locked himself out of $1 billion. The heavy glass door clicked shut. Eleanor and Harrison stepped out into the main hallway. The air was thick and cold. A low, constant hum of fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. The metallic taste of cheap waiting room coffee lingered bitterly on Eleanor's tongue. At the far end of the long corridor, Vance stood near the elevators. He was talking to his divorce attorney. They were laughing loudly. The sound bounced off the polished granite walls. They looked like two men who had just won a championship game. They thought they had successfully ruined her life during the splitting assets meeting. Eleanor watched them. She did not feel angry. She felt a profound sense of detachment. She was looking at a ghost. Suddenly, a shadow stepped into her peripheral vision. It was Paige. The other woman had been waiting in the lobby area. Paige walked slowly toward Eleanor. The harsh, sharp click of her stiletto heels on the linoleum floor echoed like a ticking clock. Click, click, click. Harrison stepped forward slightly. He positioned himself between Eleanor and Paige. He was ready to protect his client. "It is fine, Harrison," Eleanor said softly. She placed a hand on his arm. Paige stopped 3 feet away. She was 29 years old. Her skin was flawless. Her hair was perfectly styled. She wore a dress paid for by stolen money. Paige looked at Eleanor with a mixture of pity and arrogant triumph. She wanted to play the gracious winner. She wanted absolution from the woman she had helped destroy. "Eleanor," Paige said. Her voice was breathy and soft. "I know this is incredibly hard for you. Vance is a very special man." Eleanor just stared at her. She did not blink. "I just wanted to say something," Paige continued. She clasped her hands together in a practiced pose of sympathy. "I truly hope you find peace. Starting over at your age must be terrifying, but everything happens for a reason." It was a staggering display of arrogance. Eleanor looked at the young woman. She saw exactly what Vance saw. A shiny, easily manipulated mirror for his own ego. This was a textbook midlife crisis. Vance was a cheating husband who bought a younger version of his wife. Paige was completely unaware of how pathetic the situation truly was. Eleanor smiled. It was a soft, gentle, entirely genuine smile. "I have already found my peace, Paige," Eleanor replied quietly. Paige frowned slightly. The smile confused her. She had expected anger. She had expected tears. She did not expect serene confidence. "Well," Paige said awkwardly, "take care of yourself." She turned around and walked quickly back toward Vance. Her heels clicked rapidly away. Eleanor watched her go. "That was incredibly restrained of you," Harrison noted. He picked up his heavy leather briefcase. "She is just a symptom of his disease," Eleanor said. She pushed the elevator button. "She thinks she won a prize. She has absolutely no idea she just adopted my massive headache." The silver doors slid open. They stepped inside the empty elevator car. The machine began its long descent to the ground floor. "Everything is set for Friday afternoon," Harrison said. "I will bring the final absolute decree to the airfield at 3 o'clock exactly. Once you sign it, the divorce is irrevocably final. He will have zero legal claim to your future income." "And the acquisition funds?" Eleanor asked. "Safe in the corporate escrow account," Harrison replied. "The moment the judge stamps the final divorce papers on Monday morning, the $1 billion will drop directly into your sole name. Perfect, Eleanor said. She walked out of the building and into the warm afternoon sun. She drove back to the empty suburban house. The silence inside the walls was no longer terrifying. It was welcoming. It was the sound of her new freedom. She walked upstairs to the master bathroom. It was time for the breathing space. Eleanor reached forward and turned the heavy silver handles of the large soaking tub. The hot water rushed out of the faucet. It crashed against the porcelain with a loud, comforting roar. Steam immediately began to rise. It clouded the large mirrors. She opened a glass jar of lavender bath salts. She poured a generous handful into the rushing water. The rich, calming floral scent filled the small room. She slowly removed her clothes. She stepped into the massive tub. The water was almost too hot. It burned slightly against her skin. It was exactly what she needed. Eleanor sat down. She slid down into the deep water until it covered her shoulders. Then, she took a deep breath and submerged her head completely. Under the water, the world was completely silent. The roar of the faucet vanished. The ticking of the clocks disappeared. The memory of Vance's mocking laughter washed away. She stayed under the surface for 10 long seconds. She washed off 20 years of shrinking herself to fit his ego. She washed off the shame of ignoring the obvious signs. She washed off the humiliation of the morning meeting. She emerged from the water. She gasped for the warm, lavender-scented air. I am no longer apologizing for existing. She spoke the affirmation out loud to the empty, steamy room. It was not a question. It was an absolute fact. She sat in the hot water for a full hour. She let the heat soak deep into her tired muscles. She felt the heavy burden of her fake marriage literally draining away. She was finding herself again. The brilliant, ambitious woman from the old journal was finally awake. The next morning was Thursday. It was the day before the final signing. Eleanor sat at the desk in her home office. The room was bathed in bright morning light. She drank a cup of strong black coffee. It tasted rich and perfectly roasted. She picked up her secure phone. She dialed the direct number for Marcus. Good morning, Eleanor, her chief financial officer answered on the first ring. Good morning, Marcus, Eleanor said. I need you to arrange a transportation detail for tomorrow afternoon. Of course, Marcus replied. Where are you going? I am going to a very small, private aviation field on the edge of the county, Eleanor explained. My husband is renting a tiny propeller plane for a weekend trip. He wants me to sign the final divorce papers on the tarmac before he takes off. Marcus laughed out loud. He wants to show off his rented toy. Exactly, Eleanor said. He wants an audience for his grand exit. I want to give him a show he will never forget. What do you need? Marcus asked. His tone shifted to pure business. I need the corporate jet, Eleanor stated. The company owned a massive, top-of-the-line Gulfstream jet. It was a flying luxury penthouse. Eleanor had purchased it 2 years ago for international client meetings. Vance knew absolutely nothing about it. The Gulfstream is currently at the city hangar, Marcus said. I can have the flight crew ready by noon. Have them in the air by 2:30, Eleanor directed. I will text you the exact coordinates of the private airfield. I want the jet to land at exactly 3:15 in the afternoon. Do not arrive 1 minute early. 3:15, Marcus confirmed. The timing will be perfectly precise. Tell the flight attendant to prepare a bottle of sparkling water, Eleanor added. I will be boarding immediately after I sign the papers. We are flying to the corporate headquarters. Understood, Madam CEO, Marcus said, respectfully. We will be waiting for you. Eleanor hung up the phone. She opened her internet browser. She searched for the small airfield Vance had chosen. It was a tiny strip of asphalt. It mostly catered to crop dusters and amateur pilots. The arrival of a billionaire corporate jet would shake the entire facility. She smiled. She closed the laptop. She walked into her bedroom closet. She bypassed all the modest conservative clothes Vance preferred her to wear. She bypassed the itchy wool sweaters and the dull gray dresses. She walked to the very back of the deep closet. She unzipped a black garment bag. Inside was a tailored, stark white designer suit. It was sharp. It was powerful. It was the armor of an executive. She pulled it out and hung it on the door. She placed a pair of expensive black heels on the floor beneath it. She packed a single leather overnight bag. She packed her laptop, her secure phone, and a few essentials. She did not need to pack heavy. She could buy anything she wanted anywhere in the world. She walked downstairs. The house was already half empty. The moving company had taken Vance's boxes away yesterday. She walked through the silent living room. She looked at the grandfather clock. 24 hours left. Vance thought he had successfully stolen her future. He thought he was leaving her trapped in this suburban cage with an old minivan and a broken heart. He had no idea that she already held the keys to the sky. Eleanor poured herself another cup of coffee. She drank it slowly. She watched the sun move across the hardwood floor. She felt a deep, steady calm. The mirror spiral had reached its final layers. The panic was entirely gone. The grief was completely spent. Only quiet, focused strength remained. Tomorrow afternoon, the game of pretending would finally end. Tomorrow afternoon, she would sign her name. And tomorrow afternoon, the entire world was going to change. The hot wind whipped across the flat, black asphalt. It was a low, steady howl. The air smelled sharply of aviation fuel and melted tar. Heat radiated up from the ground in wavy, shimmering lines. The afternoon sun was blindingly bright. Eleanor steered the old blue minivan through the chain-link gates of the private county airfield. The brakes squealed loudly as she parked near the main hangar. It was an embarrassing sound. It was the sound of a woman who had lost everything. She turned off the engine. She sat in the quiet van for exactly 1 minute. She looked down at her clothes. She wore the sharp, tailored white designer suit. It was a stark contrast to the rusty minivan. It was the only hint of the truth she allowed herself to reveal today. She picked up her leather purse. She opened the heavy metal door. She stepped out onto the hot tarmac. 100 yards away, a small white propeller plane sat on the runway. It was a rented Cessna. Vance stood next to the small wing. He wore a crisp blue linen shirt and designer sunglasses. Paige stood close beside him. She wore a large sun hat and a short yellow dress. 2 other men stood with them. They were Vance's golfing friends. He had brought an audience. He wanted his friends to see his shiny new girlfriend. He wanted them to witness his absolute victory over his boring, discarded wife. Harrison stood a few feet away from the group. He held his thick leather briefcase. He looked completely out of place in his dark corporate suit. Vance's divorce attorney stood next to him. Eleanor began to walk towards them. Her black heels clicked firmly against the asphalt. Click, click, click. Click. Vance saw her approaching. He nudged one of his friends. The friend looked at Eleanor and smirked. They were laughing at her. They thought she was a pathetic, broken woman coming to beg for scraps. Eleanor kept her face perfectly blank. Layer 6 of the emotional spiral was fully engaged. She felt no anger. She felt no humiliation. She felt a quiet, powerful curiosity about the woman she was about to become. "You are late," Vance said loudly as she approached. He checked his heavy silver watch. "It is 3 o'clock. We have a flight path cleared for 3:30. "I am sorry," Eleanor replied. She kept her voice soft. The old van was having trouble starting. Vance rolled his eyes behind his dark sunglasses. He looked at his friends. "Typical," Vance said. "Always making excuses. Let us just get this over with." He snapped his fingers at his lawyer. The slick lawyer opened his briefcase. He pulled out a thick stack of papers. The wind tried to catch the edges. The lawyer clipped them to a heavy wooden clipboard. "These are the final absolute decrees," the lawyer said. He handed the clipboard to Harrison. "Everything is exactly as we agreed upon in the conference room. No changes." Harrison took the clipboard. He looked at Eleanor. His eyes were sharp and intelligent. He knew exactly what was about to happen. "Eleanor," Harrison said formally, "I need you to review the first page." Eleanor took the heavy wooden board. The paper was warm from the sun. Printed across the top were the words, "Final Judgment of Dissolution of Marriage." She read the paragraphs carefully. The legal language was absolute. By signing this document, she was waiving her right to all marital discovery. She was accepting the $10,000. She was giving Vance the house and the savings. And, most importantly, the document stated that from the exact moment of signing, all future assets acquired by either party were strictly individual property. The trap was perfectly set. "Is it all there?" Vance asked impatiently. He crossed his arms. "Do we need to read it out loud for you?" "It is all here," Eleanor said quietly. Vance reached into his shirt pocket. He pulled out a cheap plastic pen. He held it out toward her. "It is for the best, Elle," Vance said. He offered a fake, condescending smile. "You will see. You need to learn how to stand on your own 2 feet." Eleanor looked at his outstretched hand. She looked at the cheap blue pen. She reached out. Her fingers closed around the smooth plastic barrel. She experienced the 8th mirror technique moment. She held the pen above the paper. She felt the impossible weight of 20 years concentrated in 2 ounces of cheap plastic. This pen held her entire past. It held the young software engineer who quit her job to appease a fragile man. It held the lonely nights organizing spice jars. It held the silence. It held the lies. Starting over feels impossible, but staying is worse. She whispered the affirmation entirely in her own mind. It was a profound, absolute truth. Staying with a stranger who stole from her was a slow death. Jumping into the unknown was terrifying, but it meant she was alive. "Whenever you are ready," Harrison said softly. Eleanor lowered the tip of the pen to the signature line. She did not hesitate. She pressed the blue ink into the thick white paper. She wrote her first name. She wrote her last name with bold, sweeping strokes. She moved to the second page. She signed again. She moved to the final page. She pressed down hard. The signature was perfect. She lifted the pen. The wind blew across the tarmac. Eleanor watched the dark blue ink sink into the paper. She watched the wet shine of the letters slowly fade into a matte finish. The ink dried. It took exactly 3 seconds. 1, 2, 3. In those 3 seconds, the invisible chains of a 20-year marriage snapped completely. She was financially severed. She was legally unbound. The $1.2 billion sitting in the corporate escrow account was now legally hers, and hers alone. Eleanor felt a massive physical weight lift off her shoulders. She took a deep breath of the hot, fuel-scented air. It tasted like absolute freedom. She handed the wooden clipboard back to Harrison. Harrison took it. He checked the signatures. He nodded. "I will file these with the private judge on Monday morning," Harrison said. He looked at Vance's lawyer. "The marriage is legally over." Vance let out a loud theatrical sigh of relief. He turned a page. He pulled her close and kissed the side of her head. "Finally," Vance said. He looked back at Eleanor. His expression was full of pity. "Take the $10,000, Eleanor. Buy yourself some nice clothes. Maybe take a computer class. Get a receptionist job somewhere." Eleanor did not respond. She just looked at him. He was so small. He was a tiny, predictable man standing next to a tiny, rented airplane. He thought he was the king of the world. "We are heading out," Vance said to his friends. "We have wine tasting reservations at 5 o'clock." Vance turned his back on Eleanor. He began to walk toward the small white Cessna. Paige followed close behind him. The friends started walking toward their own parked cars. Vance's lawyer snapped his briefcase shut. "A pleasure doing business," the lawyer said to Harrison. He walked away without looking at Eleanor. Harrison and Eleanor were left standing alone on the runway. The heat radiated around them. "Are you okay?" Harrison asked quietly. "I am better than okay," Eleanor replied. She handed the cheap plastic pen to Harrison. "I am completely free." Harrison slipped the final signed divorce papers into his secure leather bag. "The trap is closed," Harrison confirmed. "He cannot touch your company. He cannot touch the buyout money. You played him perfectly." Eleanor looked at her gold wristwatch. It was exactly 3:14 in the afternoon. "My ride should be arriving in exactly 1 minute," Eleanor said. Harrison looked around the empty asphalt. He looked at the rusty blue minivan. "Are you not driving the van home?" Harrison asked. "No," Eleanor said. "I am leaving the keys in the ignition. Vance's lawyer can come pick it up on Monday. It belongs to him now." Harrison frowned slightly in confusion. Suddenly, a loud, deep rumbling sound echoed across the flat fields. It was not the high-pitched whine of the small propeller planes. It was a massive, vibrating roar. It shook the ground beneath their feet. Eleanor looked up at the bright blue sky. She saw a small, silver dot breaking through the thin, white clouds. The dot grew larger with terrifying speed. Vance and Paige had reached the steps of their rented Cessna. Vance heard the massive roar. He stopped walking. He turned around. He put his hand over his eyes to block the bright sun. His friends stopped by their cars. They looked up at the sky. The airfield manager ran out of the main building. He wore a bright yellow safety vest. He waved 2 orange, illuminated wands frantically in the air. He was screaming at the small planes to stay grounded. The massive silver machine dropped lower. The roar of the jet engines became deafening. It was a wall of pure, mechanical power. Eleanor stood perfectly still. The wind from the approaching engines whipped her hair around her face. Her white suit gleamed in the sunlight. She did not look at the sky. She looked directly at Vance. She watched the arrogant smirk slowly slide off his face. She watched confusion replace it. The game of pretending was officially over. The massive silver shadow blocked out the bright afternoon sun. The ground shook violently beneath their feet. The thunderous roar of the twin engines swallowed every other sound on the tarmac. The smell of burning jet fuel washed over the hot asphalt. Eleanor did not flinch. She stood tall in her white tailored suit. The hot wind whipped her dark hair back from her face. The aircraft was a state-of-the-art Gulfstream jet. It was painted sleek metallic silver with dark-tinted windows. It looked like a massive spaceship next to Vance's rented white propeller plane. The heavy jet slowly turned. The landing gear squealed against the black runway. It rolled directly toward the main hangar. It stopped exactly 50 feet away from where Eleanor and Harrison stood. The engines began to spool down. A high-pitched whine slowly faded into a deep, mechanical hum. Vance dropped his expensive sunglasses. They bounced on the asphalt. He did not bend down to pick them up. He just stared at the massive luxury jet. His friends walked slowly toward him. Their mouths were hanging open. They were entirely captivated by the sudden display of extreme wealth. Paige clutched Vance's arm. The other woman looked incredibly nervous. The sheer scale of the jet made her expensive yellow dress look cheap and silly. "Who is that?" Vance asked loudly over the dying engine noise. "Did a celebrity land here?" Vance's divorce attorney stepped forward. He squinted at the side of the aircraft. There was a sleek, minimalist corporate logo painted near the heavy door. That is a private corporate jet, the lawyer said. The heavy side door of the Gulfstream popped open. It folded down smoothly with a loud hydraulic hiss. It formed a perfect set of metal stairs with a red carpeted center. A woman stepped out into the bright sunlight. She wore a sharp navy blue uniform. She was the head flight attendant. Vance puffed out his chest. He smoothed the front of his blue linen shirt. He assumed the jet was owned by a wealthy connection he could network with. He was a man who always tried to stand near power. He took 2 steps toward the metal stairs. He put on his best corporate smile. The flight attendant walked down the carpeted steps. She carried a silver tray with a tall crystal glass. The glass was filled with iced, sparkling water and a thin slice of lime. She did not look at Vance. She walked straight past the cheating husband. She walked directly toward Eleanor. Vance stopped moving. His eager smile froze on his face. The flight attendant stopped in front of Eleanor. She offered a deep, highly respectful nod. "Good afternoon, Madam CEO," the flight attendant said clearly. Her voice carried easily across the silent tarmac. "The cabin is fully prepared for you. We have secured your direct route to the corporate headquarters." Eleanor took the cold crystal glass from the silver tray. Condensation dripped onto her fingers. The ice clinked softly against the crystal rim. "Thank you, Sarah," Eleanor replied. "I am ready." Vance's mouth opened and closed. He looked like a fish suffocating on dry land. "What is happening?" Vance asked. His voice cracked. It sounded high and panicked. He looked at the flight attendant. He looked at the massive silver jet. He looked back at his discarded wife. Eleanor took a slow sip of the cold, sparkling water. It tasted incredibly clean. Harrison stepped forward. He stood next to Eleanor. He tapped the secure leather bag containing the signed divorce papers. "I believe my client is leaving now," Harrison said to Vance's lawyer. The opposing divorce attorney looked entirely bewildered. He stared at the private jet. He stared at Eleanor's designer suit. He suddenly realized he had been playing a game against a master. "Your client?" Vance shouted. He pointed a shaking finger at Eleanor. "She does not own a jet. She is a housewife. She plays on her computer." Eleanor handed the empty crystal glass back to the flight attendant. She turned her head slowly. She looked directly into Vance's eyes. This was layer 7 of the emotional spiral. The transparent mirror. Eleanor looked at the man she had loved for 20 years. She looked at the man who had constantly belittled her. She looked at the man who had stolen their emergency savings to buy a sofa for a 29-year-old junior associate. She felt absolutely nothing. There was no anger left in her chest. There was no bitter resentment. There was no desperate need for revenge. He was simply a man she used to know. He was a small, irrelevant detail in her distant past. "My computer projects were quite successful, Vance," Eleanor said softly. Her voice was perfectly calm and level. "I finalized the sale of my tech firm yesterday morning. The corporate buyout was for $1.2 billion. The words hit Vance like a massive physical blow. He stumbled backward, his leather shoe caught on the rough asphalt. He almost fell over. "Billion?" Vance gasped. $1.2 billion? His handsome face drained of all color. He looked physically sick. He looked utterly terrified. Paige let go of his arm immediately. She stepped away from him. She stared at Eleanor with wide, disbelieving eyes. The other woman suddenly realized she had not won a grand prize at all. She had won a foolish man who just gave away an entire empire. "But the splitting assets agreement," Vance stammered. He looked frantically at his divorce attorney. "We just signed the papers. Stop the papers right now." "The papers are fully executed and binding," Harrison said firmly. He held up his leather bag. "You demanded a fast, uncontested divorce. You demanded we waive all financial discovery. You got exactly what you asked for, Vance. You now own a suburban house and an old minivan." Vance grabbed his dark hair with both hands. He looked at his shiny white Cessna. It suddenly looked like a cheap plastic toy. He looked at his golfing friends. They were staring at him with a heavy mixture of pity and shock. He had paraded his new life in front of them to show his dominance. Now they were watching his absolute, crushing humiliation. "Eleanor, wait," Vance pleaded. He took a stumbling step toward her. His voice was whining and deeply desperate. "We were married for 20 long years. You cannot do this to me. Half of that company is legally mine." "Not according to the exact ink you just forced me to sign," Eleanor replied. "I supported you," Vance begged. He was practically crying, tears welled in his eyes. "I paid the heavy mortgage while you built that business." "You mocked me every single day," Eleanor said. The truth hung heavy and cold in the afternoon air. "You treated me like a useless burden. You used our joint savings to fund your pathetic midlife crisis." She did not raise her voice. She did not need to shout. The simple truth was loud enough. Vance fell to his knees on the hot asphalt. The expensive fabric of his blue linen pants scraped against the rough stone. He did not care. He was helplessly watching $1 billion walk away from him forever. "Please, Elle," Vance whispered. Eleanor looked down at him. She felt a brief flash of gentle pity. It was the exact same pity a person feels for a bird that flies blindly into a clear glass window. "You wanted me to learn how to stand on my own 2 feet, Eleanor said. "I did. Starting over will not be so bad." She turned around. She walked gracefully toward the metal stairs of the Gulfstream jet. Harrison walked closely behind her. She climbed the red-carpeted steps. Her black heels clicked firmly against the metal. Click, click, click. She reached the top of the tall stairs. She did not turn back around. She did not need to see his broken face one last time. She did not need to gloat over his ruin. The ultimate victory was walking away into a bigger life and never looking back. She stepped into the cool, luxurious cabin of the private jet. The hydraulic stairs folded up behind her smoothly. The heavy metal door sealed shut with a solid final click. The massive engines began to spool up again. The high-pitched whine returned. The ground shook violently. Inside the beautiful cabin, Eleanor sat down in a wide leather captain's chair. She buckled the sleek silver seatbelt across her lap. Harrison sat in the matching leather chair directly across from her. He opened his briefcase. He pulled out a fresh stack of thick corporate documents. "The bank transfer is ready for your final authorization," Harrison said. Eleanor looked out the thick, tinted oval window. She saw Vance still kneeling on the hot tarmac. He looked incredibly small. His friends were slowly walking back to their parked cars. Paige was standing far away from him, looking furiously at her cell phone. His entire fake world was already collapsing into dust. The massive jet slowly taxied down the long, black runway. Eleanor turned her attention away from the window. She looked at the blank, legal documents resting on the polished wood table in front of her. She reached into her designer purse. She pulled out a heavy, gold-plated fountain pen. It was the expensive pen she used exclusively for corporate business. She unscrewed the gold cap. She was no longer the invisible, quiet wife. She was no longer the victim of a cruel betrayal. She was no longer shrinking herself to fit inside someone else's tiny life. The jet engines roared to maximum power. The aircraft surged forward down the runway with incredible force. Eleanor felt the intense pressure of the acceleration press her firmly back into the soft leather seat. The nose of the heavy plane lifted off the ground. The wheels completely left the black asphalt. They were flying. The heavy rumble of the ascent smoothed out into a soft, steady hum. The private jet broke through the thick cloud cover. It leveled off at 40,000 feet. Sunlight flooded through the thick oval windows. It painted the luxurious cabin in bright, warm gold. The air inside smelled of fresh leather and faint citrus. Eleanor took a deep, slow breath. She felt weightless. Harrison sat across from her. He placed the thick stack of corporate documents onto the polished wood table. He smoothed the edges of the heavy paper. "The final step," Harrison said. "The holding escrow is unlocked. The funds are waiting for your signature." Eleanor picked up her gold fountain pen. The metal felt heavy and substantial in her fingers. "Just minutes ago, I was signing divorce papers with a cheap plastic pen," Eleanor said softly. "It feels like that happened in a completely different lifetime." "Your divorce attorney duties are officially over," Harrison replied. He offered a warm, genuine smile. "I am strictly your corporate counsel again." Eleanor smiled back. She looked down at the signature line. She pressed the gold nib against the thick, white paper. She signed her name. The dark black ink flowed smoothly. It was a bold, confident signature. It belonged to a woman who owned her own destiny. "Done," Eleanor said. She handed the document back to Harrison. Harrison placed it into his leather briefcase. He closed the heavy brass clasps. They clicked shut with a satisfying snap. "Congratulations, Eleanor," Harrison said. $1.2 billion is officially entirely yours. The transfer is complete." "Thank you, Harrison," Eleanor replied. "For everything." Eleanor turned her head. She looked out the oval window. Far below, the world looked incredibly small. The town where she had lived for 20 years was just a tiny, gray patchwork of tiny squares. The suburban house was invisible. The local airfield was just a microscopic black line. Everything that had felt so overwhelmingly large this morning was completely insignificant from up here. She experienced her ultimate wisdom moment. Looking down at the white clouds, she finally understood. Vance had not stolen her best years. He had merely trained her for them. He had taught her patience. He had taught her strategy. The prison door had been unlocked the whole time. She was her own jailer. She had stayed because she thought she had to be small to be loved. Now, she knew she did not need a small love. Suddenly, the secure cell phone on the table began to vibrate. Buzz, buzz, buzz. The harsh electronic sound broke the quiet peace of the cabin. Eleanor looked down at the bright screen. It was Vance. He was calling her private number. She did not answer. She let it ring until it went to voicemail. 3 seconds later, the text messages began to pour in. They appeared rapidly on the glowing screen. "Eleanor, please answer the phone," the first text read. "We can fix this," the second text said. "I made a terrible mistake. She means nothing to me. I will tear up the divorce papers," the third text read. "Come back to the airfield. Let us talk about our future." Eleanor stared at the desperate words. She felt a profound, absolute peace. The words held no power over her. They were just desperate noise from a man who only loved money. This was not just a story about starting over. This was a story about finding herself again. The brilliant, ambitious 28-year-old woman from the old journal was finally fully awake. She was 48 years old, and she was entirely unstoppable. "Is that him?" Harrison asked quietly. He looked at the buzzing phone. "Yes," Eleanor replied. "What is he saying?" Harrison asked. "He says he made a mistake," Eleanor said. Her voice was perfectly calm. "He says he wants to fix our marriage." Harrison let out a short, disbelieving laugh. "Of course he does. $1 billion can make a cheating husband suddenly very loyal." "It is pathetic," Eleanor stated. She picked up the cell phone. She opened the contact settings for Vance. She pressed her finger against the red button on the screen. "Block caller." The screen asked for a final confirmation. Eleanor pressed confirm. The phone went instantly dark. It went completely silent. Vance was permanently erased from her digital world, just as he was erased from her legal world. She placed the silent phone back onto the polished table. "He is gone," Eleanor said. The flight attendant walked softly down the carpeted aisle. She carried a fresh crystal glass of iced water. She placed it gently on the table next to Eleanor. "We will be landing in exactly 2 hours, Madam CEO," the flight attendant said. "Thank you," Eleanor replied. Eleanor reached into her leather bag. She pulled out her sleek silver laptop. She set it on the table in front of her. She opened the screen. The computer woke up instantly. She clicked on a new icon on her desktop. It opened a completely blank, bright white document. The green cursor blinked steadily at the top left corner. Blink, blink, blink. It was an empty page. It was a vast, open territory. Harrison opened his own laptop across the table. He began to type quietly. The soft clatter of the keyboard blended with the deep hum of the jet engines. Eleanor rested her hands on the smooth silver keyboard. She did not know exactly what she was going to build next, but she knew it would be massive. She knew it would be entirely hers. She had 20 years of quiet observation to draw from. She had $1 billion in capital. She had absolute, unshakable confidence. She took a deep breath. The air filled her lungs. It felt clean. It felt completely free. She let the breath out slowly. The cabin was peaceful. The steady, powerful rhythm of the engines carried her forward. She was flying fast. She was flying high. And she was never, ever going to shrink herself for anyone again. The green cursor blinked. Eleanor began to type.
Welcome back. Let's unpack what we just witnessed, because Eleanor's journey is far more than just a satisfying revenge fantasy. It is a psychological masterclass in reclaiming your own identity. For 20 years, Eleanor committed the quietest, most common form of self-betrayal. She shrank herself to accommodate a fragile man's ego. How many of us have done the exact same thing? How many times have we dimmed our own light, hidden our successes, or swallowed our voices just to keep the peace in our homes or our relationships? Eleanor's story shows us the devastating cost of that compromise. Vance didn't just steal their joint savings. He steadily robbed her of her space, her confidence, and her reality through constant manipulation. He used classic gaslighting tactics, denying his actions, attacking her sanity, and reversing the roles to make himself the victim. But the true brilliance of this story lies in Eleanor's counter-strategy. When faced with ultimate betrayal, human nature screams for an immediate reaction. We want to yell, to expose the truth, to fight for our pride in that very moment. Eleanor did the impossible. She weaponized her invisibility. She realized that the greatest power you can hold over a narcissist is completely detaching from their validation. This is the phase of the transparent mirror. True revenge isn't about destroying the other person in a fiery explosion of anger. True revenge is absolute indifference. It is looking at someone who once held your entire heart and realizing they are utterly irrelevant to your future. Vance's ultimate punishment wasn't just losing $500 million. It was the crushing realization that he had traded an empire for a cheap, rented illusion. He thought he was outsmarting a dependent housewife, only to discover he was a tiny pawn on a chessboard she completely owned. The most powerful takeaway from Eleanor's silent victory is this: never apologize for existing, and never make yourself small for someone who is intimidated by your greatness. If someone requires you to be less so they can feel like more, they do not deserve a seat at your table. Starting over might feel like stepping into a terrifying void, but as Eleanor proved, staying in a cage where your soul is dying is infinitely worse. Let them have their small victories while you secure your empire. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful story. with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience. We believe that great stories can change lives, and we are committed to bringing you content that matters. Thank you for being part of our community.